Whenever we show a context of a building, we almost always see trees in it. Because unlike other props like cars, people or furniture, you cannot move the trees away because they exist everywhere. But drawing trees can be an awkward experience, and poorly drawn trees can take away from the drawing. So today I wanted to share a couple of straightforward ways you can draw the trees to complement your architectural design. So the first approach is the stylized approach, and it can be used in the early stages of design development or for cartoony types of illustrations. So as a first stage, I usually like to use the pencil underlays for maintaining proportions, the overall compositions on the page, and guide my drawings. So the first way I'm going to show you how to draw trees is using a simple circle as a starting point. So after the first circle is drawn, then we can start adding the tree trunk and simple branches within the circle using simple straight lines at an angles, and also color in the trunk in black. I like to add a second line for notional shadow around the circle to give the tree a more diagrammatic look. The second way is similar to the first one. This time we substitute the circle with a shape that's more closer to the actual tree shape, but the style still remains the same. I'll use this kind of like elongated egg shape slash a hexagon type of form, and just like before, I'll finish off with the trunk underneath, and I'll add branches as well. Notice how the lines that represent the foliage are straight with rounded corners. This is all intentional to make the trees appear more stylized, but also it's easier to draw and quicker as well. So the third way is the semi-realistic way, and this is basically using exactly the same approach as before with the tree trunk and the branches that spread out. But this time we're going to substitute the foliage of the tree with a silhouette that resembles the actual tree. So essentially all trees share the same basic geometry underneath the foliage, which kind of vaguely resembles a rectangle with slanted edges. If you want to draw multiple trees or a massing of trees, you can always omit the branches. We can then add the marker to the trees. I like to use uniform color distribution with slight accent to the darker areas, and given that the shade of green is very dark, I like to use a slightly lighter version than that. Same kind of depth of color, but a bit more on the pastel side and a bit more washed out. So now that we have looked at the stylized approach, now it's time to look at a bit more realistic way to draw trees. And the way I like to go about it is by imagining that the tree is a 3D geometric shape. And I'll start this demonstration by using a simple bush with its foliage. So in its essence, a bush can be expressed as a circle, and I'll add a shade to the circle with darker and lighter areas, and I'll hatch them in using straight lines. So in the second drawing, we'll make the circle irregular because it's very difficult to find a perfectly sphered foliage in nature. So what I want to do is I want to make the edges of the bush irregular to almost represent a big rock-like shape. And this shape is made out of short and straight lines. And again, similarly to the circle slash sphere example, we can add some shadow using the straight hatch with darker and lighter areas. So now that we understand the basic irregular geometry that goes into the bush, let's develop the second approach a little bit. So we use the same approach as we did in drawing the rock, but the exception this time is going to be that we're going to swap the straight edges for the wiggly lines. So the trick here is to really make the wiggly lines represent the edge of the tree as much as possible, which might take a little bit of practice to perfect. Once the shape and the shadow areas are defined, we can then fill in the shadows with scattered wobbly lines, and the darker areas can have a more dense pattern. So now that we looked at this bush drawing, now we can replicate the same approach but with the actual tree shapes. And again, I'll start with a simple pencil underlay. This is just to make my task a bit easier and to keep the overall composition on the sheet neat and tidy. So just like with the bush example, let's draw circles to represent the first tree. If you think about it, the tree is basically like a bush, except it has clusters of leaves coming out of its branches. The larger clusters are usually at the bottom and the smaller ones are at the top. And similarly to how we did it with the circle, we can add the shadow to these clusters. And similarly as before, we can now turn our tree into a rock clusters using straight lines, just the same way as we did it before. I'm looking at the circle tree here for reference, and I'm just kind of trying to stylize it by using straight edges at different angles. And the same approach applies for the shadow areas as well. And lastly, what we can do is we can turn this rocky tree shape into an actual realistic shape by tracing the straight lines with a wiggly line and tracing the shadow areas with a wiggly line as well, and then finally adding the pattern to represent the shadow and denser pattern within to represent darker areas of the shadow, to give a greater sense that the tree is a 3D geometrical shape. And then lastly, we can add the color to the trees with a marker, just exactly the same way as we outlined in the stylized section. If you like this video, you might also like this other video I made over here that talks about how to draw like an architect. So check that video out, and I'll see you on the other side.